name is Vicky Xu. It's pronounced a bit like the shoe on your feet. And just like so many other shoes in Australia, it was also made in China.
I asked Vicky to present the 2019 annual inaugural Chaser Lecture because she's a smart and funny person and her personal story's really compelling.
I'm here to tell my story today, mine, and I hope my story can make you think about what you can do as China is on the rise to become a new superpower. I'm not going to give you the answers because I'm in enough trouble for asking the questions.
Vicky Xu is a journalist. She too has been trolled and intimidated for speaking out against China.
There have been crackdowns on dissent overseas. We're seeing surveillance on Uyghurs who live overseas.
Vicky's only 25, but she was one of the first journalists to really blow the lid open on the Uyghur issue here in Australia.
The Uyghur story is one of the most serious mass human rights violations in the world today. China doesn't want you to know about it.
Vicky is quite a controversial character. I think her explosiveness has really given her a huge media platform. But Vicky is just one voice of a very complex debate on the growth of mainland China.
I'm definitely considered provocative at times. The label anti-China has been put on me by certain people, but that's not how I see myself.
Vicky's in a sensitive position. She's in a difficult position. Vicky has exposed China to a lot of scrutiny at great personal cost.
I've basically become a traitor to the country, and many people are just very angry. But what a lot of people don't know is that just a few years back, I was just like them.
Thank you for coming along. Your next act, are you ready?
There are so many strands to Vicky's life. The move to stand-up comedy is pretty recent for Vicky.
I don't like to tell people that I'm made in China because, you know.
Comedy for Vicky was a pressure release to get lots of things off her mind and to be able to speak about them in a way that was uninhibited.
Whenever I tell people that this is all made in China, I don't know, I feel like a Huawei phone. We're both cheap, easy to break, and a threat to national security.
The idea of a young female Chinese comic satirizing the Chinese government is pretty explosive and pretty rare anywhere in the world.
I've got a day job, guys. I have a day job. I work as a journalist.
I think the Chinese government has been paying quite close attention to her. But Vicky is not someone who's going to be silenced.
I wrote an article earlier this year about the Uyghurs. They're Turkic Muslims. They're detained in China. And the other day I got some feedback from an audience member, and he was like, "Oh, can you talk about something a little bit more uplifting? Because this is a comedy room after all." And I was like, "Yeah, absolutely cannot." Anyway.
I do think it's very personal for Vicky. New converts in any faith are some of the most intense. And I think in some ways this is a conversion that Vicky's gone through.
I grew up in northwest China in a tiny town. By tiny, in Chinese standards, that means some 200,000 people. It's one of the poorest provinces in China.
Vicky was an only child and the golden child. And her parents put everything they had into her education and into her well-being. All they wanted was for her to be a success.
The Chinese school system was quite demanding. Everything was about conforming. Students have to excel in political studies. You know, if you want to be a class captain, you have to wear your red scarf every day. The red scarf means that you belong to the party. I was a class captain for a few years.
我从2003年就认识 Vicky 了。她的学习成绩非常的好，就是属于顶尖的水平，而且是一直很好。她的理想应该是变成一名记者。她念的这所专业在中国传媒大学里面，所以我觉得可以算得上是中国最顶尖的关于传媒类的学校吧。
All open. How are you?
How are you?
How are you?
Vicky was training to be an English language broadcaster for the Chinese state media in Beijing.
How are you?
So that would mean that she'd be presenting news all around the world through a Chinese lens.
One of our professors would be telling us our mission is very important. It helps the world understand China in a positive way. In my second year at university in Beijing, there was an opportunity to go abroad and take a gap year.
I first met Vicky when she arrived in Perth in 2014. She was working at a high school that I was working at, teaching Mandarin. Vicky was very proud of China. She was loyal, nationalist, 100%.
My first impression of Australia was really good. I just remember seeing people being like relaxed.
After a few months, Vicky decided that she wanted to get educated in Australia. So she applied to Melbourne University to do political science and media studies. Just before she left Perth, she saw a poster advertising a documentary on Tiananmen Square.
I remember looking at that poster. I knew it was meant to say something significant, but, you know, I'm quite good at Chinese history. I don't think there was ever a crisis on Tiananmen Square in 1989.
30 years ago, the people of China dared to hope for a democratic future. But on the night of June 3, 1989, the People's Liberation Army turned its guns on the people.
Tiananmen Square was a series of protests in which the Chinese government cracked down on a whole bunch of people who were looking for greater freedom and democracy, including students who were just killed or just removed from the streets.
These tanks have just provided an escort for about 30 troop trucks, which have come into Tiananmen Square from the east of the city.
I went to the documentary screening.
Hospital morgues are running out of space for the unending procession of their victims.
When I first learned about Tiananmen Square crackdown, I think the overwhelming feeling was grief. And there was also just this sense of betrayal because, you know, growing up in China, I had never seen any material about this event.
We're talking about the gunshots in the fight. You know, I mean, firing at the innocent people.
My parents, teachers, they knew about this, but no one said anything. So I felt shocked and sad and just, yeah, couldn't believe it.
I mean, Tiananmen Square is one of the biggest stories of the Chinese Communist Party's rule over China throughout its entire reign. And the idea that it could just be erased from the entire story of China for someone like Vicky is pretty astounding.
But what's interesting is that within a few months, I came to rationalize the whole thing, right? There were accounts to say that this was a CIA inside job. I started going to university, and all of a sudden, I just became very, very overwhelmed by the amount of negative information about China around me. I was trying to tackle these accusations of, you know, China's human rights abuses, and I was finding inconsistencies and all this hypocrisy in the discourse of human rights, and in the end, I just got very frustrated.
She felt that as the only Chinese student in the class, she was obliged to explain China's action to other students.
I wanted to explain to people around me how some of the so-called human rights abuses are actually justified because, you know, you have a big country to run and you just simply can't be nice to everyone. I was arguing with my peers, my professors, my boyfriend. I was getting a little upset and my sense of nationalism was heightened. The more I defended China, the more funnier the country I felt. And in the end, I came to this tattoo parlor and get myself this Chinese national flag tattooed on my ankle.
Even as Vicky was defending China in class, I think behind the scenes, she was really starting to weigh the evidence.
It's just really sort of difficult to navigate.
I first met Vicky in 2016. I mean, in this kind of situation, it's important to be sceptical with most of what you encounter. She was questioning the very basic ideas that her family had instilled in her.
There's a lot of information that is just suppressed, you know, deleted overnight.
Yeah. She said that she was interested in interrogating, I guess, how the Chinese Communist Party had formed her views about the world.
It seems like getting hotter and hotter.
And for her final assignment, she interviewed dissidents from China.
Hi, Vicky.
Hi. I met one of the first Chinese dissidents that I know, and this guy named Lou Bao. He's a refugee from China. I just thought he could be a fraud, and I was going to interview him and write an expose. Remind me which part of China you're from again?
Oh, Anhui province. I told her my story. I worked as a math teacher in a Chinese college. In 2008, I got involved in some dissident activities. I was questioning whether I have foreign connections with foreign powers.
He was posting criticism of Chinese leaders online.
The worst thing I did is I posted some jokes online. I was put in prison, which was like a labor camp. I had been forced to do the manufacturing labor 14 hours per day. We were ordered to put disposable gloves into small bags, and every day we are required to make thousands. We were ordered to get up at 6 o'clock. No break after getting up. After I was released from prison, I resettled in Australia and has been diagnosed with PTSD and a variety of mental health issues, actually.
I was very touched by his story because it was so full of trauma. It kind of traumatized me, too. And it really made me rethink a lot of my previous positions.
When Vicky met Mr. Wu, I think it changed her life. She went into the interview expecting to be able to expose a traitor, and I think she left the interview shaken and concerned that everything she's been told might not be right.
Vicky went back home over the semester break and was writing for a local magazine. And while she was there in China, there was an enormous flood. Vicky saw on Chinese social media that villages in the town of Longzhou had been inundated by flooding and that they were complaining.
They thought floodwater was directed into their village so that some bigger cities downstream could survive the flood. And they said for 4 days, they didn't have any rescue resources from the government.
I was incredibly worried because I knew that she was a Chinese journalist reporting on a story that clearly was sensitive to the government.
We interviewed some villagers. They were devastated by what they had lost and how they didn't have any food. Within 20 minutes, the government officials arrived. They were trying to feed us the official line about what had happened. And the police took down our details, warned us not to do this again.
Despite all the risks, she decided to run the story in the New York Times, and her name must have been put on some sort of list. When she was travelling through the country later in that trip, police officers would stop her and those travelling with her. They wanted to make sure that she knew that they knew wherever she was at any time.
I started teaching Vicky in 2017, an undergrad news journalism writing class. I wasn't sure whether she knew what she was getting herself into, but she's able to do stories that few people do here in Australia.
I started to work for a range of outlets. That was my second and third year of university. I wrote for the New York Times.
Hey, Vicky, so you found anything? Have they said anything about the ambassador, or what's the kind of... Vicky wanted to uncover things that other people weren't uncovering, and she wanted to reveal things that might have otherwise stayed invisible.
They're literally accusing him of having a bunch of mental health issues.
And so from the very beginning, what she was working on was sensitive.
After a short stint with the New York Times, Vicky came to work in the ABC's Asia-Pacific newsroom. Vicky was adamant and relentless in her push to do a story about the Uyghurs. I would keep telling her, what's the deal with this story? Why do you need to do a 3,000, 4,000 word feature on it? And she would repeat, Stephen, you don't understand. You don't understand. People need to know this.
The Uyghurs are an ethnic minority who live in northwest China in the province of Xinjiang. They're mostly Muslim. Over the past few years, China has been increasingly repressive. Most recently, placing up to 1 million, some estimates say up to 2 million, in these political indoctrination camps. It likes to call them re-education camps, but it's more like an indoctrination camp.
The Chinese government maintains the line that they are fighting terrorism and extremism.
China did have a terrorism problem, and that is correct. I think it's important we actually acknowledge that China was suffering a terrorist problem. But that said, the response to that problem, extrajudicial detention, wiping out an entire culture, it's a human rights tragedy that we need some plain talking on.
In Australia, we have a fairly large Uyghur community, about 3,000 people. And most of these people have friends or relatives detained in these camps.
Vicky had very strong connections to the Uyghur community and was able to get a lot of these people that had family members in detention to go on the record. At the time, it was very difficult to get anybody to even speak about it, let alone identify themselves.
Almost 3 years, I haven't heard anything about my wife. My wife been charged with assembling a crowd to disturb social order. I can't believe she was being arrested. She's a very shy girl.
I guess a lot of that was seen as off limits for the Chinese authorities. Very quickly, I realized I was losing friends back home. My best friend back in college, who is now working for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, he stopped talking to me.
From the moment Vicky started digging into the Uyghurs, it was clear to me that this was going to be challenging, sensitive stuff. I told her, listen, you're taking you and everyone you love and everyone who loves you into that situation.
Last year, my grandmom was very sick, so my dad wants me to go back home to visit. But I was feeling very anxious about visiting again, and I just didn't know what was going to happen. A Chinese government official gave me this whole lecture about how I should be more careful with my words, and basically warned me to asked me to stop doing what I'm doing. By the time I was trying to fly out of China, I was having some trouble getting a boarding pass at the airport. And so I just couldn't check in. Someone said, well, is she on the list or something? And that was when things got a little suspicious. They did let me go in the end, but it was just such an alarming episode.
Thank you for your cooperation. Enjoy your flight.
My mom put me to the side and said, well, maybe do you want to do more comedy and less journalism? And she also said, maybe don't come back again anytime soon.
When she got back, she was definitely shaken. But she went on to pursue a story about the Uyghur community in Adelaide.
And we published an article featuring 2 families who have relatives stuck in China in those camps. And the good news was that because of the sort of attention on the story, those 2 families, they both had their relatives released. But the bad news that came out of that was my father got a call from the Chinese police. I mean, it was a message to say, we see you and be careful. That freaked my mom out. I was waiting for a text message to say what happened with the police, and all these crazy thoughts started to play out in my head. Maybe they're detained, maybe they're brought into the station to be questioned, or maybe they're under home arrest because it's China. My dad has stopped speaking to me. I couldn't help but feel that it's my fault. I am in this situation and I put my family in this situation. But, when I published my first article, I was 21 and I was very young and I was not expecting things to escalate to here today so quickly. But the guilt, I think I'm gonna be guilty about this forever.
Last year, hundreds and then thousands of students in Hong Kong hit the streets to really call for more freedom, more democracy. There were a whole bunch of almost satellite protests in Australia.
It's interesting because at the very same spot yesterday, there was a pro-China rally going on where patriotic students from mainland China chanted slogans and verbally abused and physically attacked people who disagreed with them.
I remember seeing Vicky's Twitter feed from one of the protests, and it was quite direct and confronting. She was translating some of the statements that people were saying in Chinese.
You had people yelling at this Hong Kong supporter, traitor, traitor. And a couple of people, I heard them saying, if the police weren't here, we're gonna beat them to death.
There was a lot of strong feelings toward Vicky's reports about the Hong Kong rallies, and a lot of people saw Vicky's reports on the rallies to be quite one-sided.
Hong Kong's a sensitive issue for China. The Chinese worldview has very strong views that Hong Kong is part of Chinese territory. They shouldn't be accepting outside voices or critical views of China in that space. But look, some Chinese students went too far. I mean, when you start tearing down walls and when you start physically abusing people, that crosses the line.
So I started getting these really awful messages. This one's saying that I'm abhorrent. I was selling out, and it's not enough if I die 100 times. There were also these articles on, in Chinese media that had my images with my eyes blacked out. That was quite creepy.
The thing that I think was interesting is their criticism of her and attempt to silence her not only backfired, it had the complete opposite effect. At a time when the China story was a really big story in Australia, Vicky became one of, if not the go-to people to help make sense of it.
The young protesters in Hong Kong are essentially saying they do not believe in the so-called one country, two systems. One rally I've covered that was back in 2017 when the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang visited. We know for sure that rally was organized by the Chinese consulate in Sydney.
One of the things I think that's going to be a great challenge for her is to not be exploited and to not let what she's trying to say be oversimplified by people who simply want to make her a weapon against China.
Forget about business opportunities for a second and think.
I think when Vicky talks about these things, she's talking without a filter, but we have to be nuanced when we talk about this issue because there is this yellow peril idea that still encroaches in Australian society.
The debate on China in Australia has had a ferocious impact on Chinese Australians, and people like Vicky Xu have copped the full brunt of Chinese nationalism, and they really need our support. On the other hand, there's other groups of Chinese Australians who feel they're unable to participate in this discussion because if they do, they will be framed as being disloyal to Australia. Their voices are cancelled, and that's a tragedy, both sides. It's a tragedy when we don't hear these voices because the real problem we have in Australia is not enough Chinese Australian voices.
I hope that Vicky has a chance to return to China at some point and to reconnect with the country. But sometimes you have to move on and build a new life.
I have no idea what the future holds for me. In the past month or so, I've been working at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute on a project about Uyghur forced labor. It's a collaboration with the Washington Post. We got this one from Weibo yesterday, and it's Tim Cook visiting this factory in Dongguan. We found out that since 2017, when the mass detention started in Xinjiang, a lot of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities have been taken out to other provinces in China. If you would be able to look at the factory from satellite, and they work for these Chinese factories under these abusive, coerced, forced conditions. Can I have a look at the sign? And these factories are supplying very, very famous, well-known global brands like Nike, Adidas, Apple. I'm hoping to be able to search her name in the victim database and see if her relatives are looking for her. So in the near future, as much as I would love to do more comedy, I'll just be doing what I am doing right now, investigating the Uyghur issue to be able to bring as much awareness to the issue as I can. I think I'm going to leave you guys with this one. I'm here with the crew of Australian Story, and they normally feature people who are pretty much dead. So this one is for the TV audience. If you are seeing this, it means I've been murdered. And we all know who did it.